There was a bell above the door. Not a buzzer, not a chime. A small brass bell on a spring. The kind that rang the same way every single time, whether it was 7 in the morning or 4:30 in the afternoon. You pushed the door open and that sound announced you. The man behind the counter looked up and nodded because he already knew your name. He might have known your father's name, too. You walked in out of the cold or the summer heat, and the place smelled like oiled wood and flour and something faintly metallic. The floor was uneven in ways you had long stopped noticing. You could find what you needed with your eyes half closed. This was the general store, and for a very long time in rural America, it was the center of everything. It is gone now, almost entirely. A few survive as curiosities, carefully preserved, serving tourists more than neighbors. But as a working institution, as the place that held a community together through the simple act of providing what people needed, the rural general store had largely disappeared by the end of the 20th century. The reasons are not mysterious, but they are worth sitting with, because what was lost was more than a place to buy flour and bootlaces. To understand it, you have to go back to the world that made it necessary. Rural America before the interstate highway, before reliable refrigeration in every home, before the supermarket chain arrived in the county seat, was a world defined by distance. A farm family might live 5 or 7 miles from the nearest small town, over roads that turned to mud in April and ice in February. You did not make that trip casually. When you went to town, you went to the general store. The store carried everything it reasonably could: dry goods and canned goods, seed and feed, rope, nails and axe handles, patent medicines lined up on a shelf behind the counter, bolts of calico fabric, tobacco, kerosene, a glass case of penny candy that children pressed their faces against. The proprietor ordered what the community asked for, and over time, the shelves became a kind of portrait of the people who lived nearby, their diets, their work, their small comforts. If a family needed something the store did not carry, the storekeeper would often order it special and hold it until it arrived. That was not unusual. That was simply how it was done. There was a potbelly stove in most of them. Men gathered around it in winter, not always to buy anything, sometimes just to stand in the warmth and talk. The general store worked as a kind of informal community hall. News traveled through it, election results, crop prices, who had been sick and who had recovered. A man might pick up his mail there in the days when the store also served as the local post office, which was common. He might settle a running account, because many rural stores operated on a credit system tied to the harvest. A family could buy through the lean months and pay when the corn came in. The storekeeper was not just a merchant. He was a trusted figure in the financial lives of his neighbors, in a way that required trust on both sides. Women came in on errands and sometimes stayed to talk. Children were sent alone with a handwritten list and a few coins. Old men sat on the porch in warm weather. The rhythm of the store's days followed the rhythm of the community's days. Busy in the morning, quiet in the afternoon, a last rush before closing. The same faces, week after week, season after season, until you stopped thinking of them as customers and simply thought of them as the people you knew. What ended all of this was not any single thing. It was a combination of forces that arrived across several decades. The rural electrification programs of the late 1930s and 1940s brought power to farm households. That meant refrigerators, and refrigerators meant families no longer needed to shop for perishables every few days. The improvement of rural roads, pushed forward by New Deal programs and post-war federal spending, made it practical to drive further than before. And the automobile itself changed how people thought about distance. What had once been a long journey to town became a simple Saturday errand. The county seat, with its newer and larger grocery stores, became reachable in a way it never had been before. Then came the post-war boom and the chain grocery model. Stores like the A&P, and later the regional supermarket chains, could buy in volume at prices a single-owner general store simply could not match. The chain store had a warehouse behind it. The general store had a man with a ledger and a relationship with a regional supplier. The economics were not even close. Families who could now drive 30 miles in 40 minutes discovered that the same dollar went further at the supermarket. This was not a failure of loyalty. It was a response to real economic pressure. Farming families were not wealthy. A lower price on a sack of sugar was not a small thing. Zoning and regulatory changes added their own quiet pressure. Expanded food safety requirements, business licensing costs, and the gradual formalization of retail all favored larger operations with capital behind them. The general store that ran on handshake credit and informal accounting now found itself in a world that required bookkeeping systems and regulatory compliance it was never built for. Some owners adapted. Most, as they aged, simply did not reopen. The decline was gradual. It spread across the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. Stores in the most remote areas held on the longest because the distance that had made them necessary in the first place still existed. But one by one, they closed. A proprietor retired and no one bought the business. A fire happened and the building was never rebuilt. A new road made the next town closer. Sometimes the building was converted into a house or simply left to come apart slowly. Sometimes a sign remained above a door that had been nailed shut for years. What replaced the general store was, in practical terms, better. The supermarket offered more selection, lower prices, consistent quality, and reliable hours. No one disputes that. The rural family of 1975 ate more varied food, spent less on groceries, and had access to goods their grandparents could not have imagined. Progress, in this case, was real. But the general store had been something beyond its inventory. It had been the place where you were known, where the transaction was secondary to the relationship, where you could stand at a counter and speak to someone who had watched you grow up, who knew your family's situation, who might extend you credit not because a credit score said to, but because he had known your father for 30 years and understood hard seasons came. That texture of daily life, small and unremarkable, made of habit and familiarity, does not get replaced when the store closes. It simply disappears. There is something worth naming in the fact that we often remember these places not for what we bought there, but for how we felt when we walked in. Recognized, unhurried, part of something that existed at a scale a person could actually understand. The store was not perfect, and neither was the world it belonged to, but it knew your name, and it rang a bell when you came through the door. And that was not nothing. If you remember a store like this, a name above the door, a storekeeper who knew your family, a glass case of candy, a porch where people talked, leave a memory in the comments. And if you're new here and this kind of quiet history interests you, there is more where this came from. Subscribe if you'd like to stay.